Okay, let's do our normal check-in. And by mutual invitation, if you're willing to share questions, comments, or reactions, either from the scholarship represented or the readings this week. And if you want to go back to week 5, we mentioned last week, by all means, feel free to go backward if we missed anything for you last week. Can I invite you to share, Lila?
Oh, hi. Yes, Mike, actually, I just put something in the chat. If we could go back just quickly to chapter 5 and Jacob's dream and why that was significant. And I believe I read that the surprise again was that God was not confined to one spot. And is that a traditional interpretation of that dream? Some of these stories just seem so odd and disjointed and unrelated to one another. And I've always been fascinated by this one and the angels and what's going on here, and anointing the rock. And is this how we get the name of Bethel? This seems to be part of the point of the story, is how that place got its name.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Lila, do you want to invite the next person to share?
Graciela.
Pass.
Yeah, I'm passing. I'm still trying to get caught up, and so I'll pass and listen.
Do you want to pass to someone in particular, Graciela?
Him?
No, okay, yeah. Well, going back to chapter 5, I found it kind of interesting that how important the well is in a number of these stories. Jacob finds Rachel at the well.
Mm-hmm.
The story of Jesus at the well seems to be a recurring theme, which I kind of found interesting. And that's really about all. I'll pass on to John.
I am going to pass today. I really don't have anything to add or to offer. Herb.
Hey, John. In chapter 6, the story of Jacob, leaving very quickly and returning to his homeland after 20 years with Laban, and how that disappointed Laban, because he said, "You didn't even give me an opportunity to say goodbye to my daughters or goodbye to my grandchildren too." And children, I think, and their relationship was kind of just based on deceit. They both deceived each other various times in various ways, and it kind of got to the point, obviously, that communication was lost. And I think that's kind of a learning for us, and that probably the most important thing in a relationship is to maintain communication. So even when it's at its bottom, you can still talk and hope for reconciliation. So I think that was a learning for me. And at the end, when Laban does chase them down and meets them, they reconcile, and that was nice. Because a good ending to a very deceitful relationship. So, let me call on Ellen.
Thanks, Herb. I think what I found in this chapter was a strong thread of family relationships and how it's gone through the centuries and it's always been really important, and also to extended families as we go along. And in spite of terrible things that we do to one another, there's always hope for the reconciliation. And I found that to be very comforting, and really have seen that in my own life in terms of family discord and reconciliation, and how meaningful it is to be able to experience that. So
Just, can I build on Ellen's, I'm sorry to go back, so you saw that not only the reconciliation with Jacob and Laban, but then Jacob and Esau too, and that ended with a very nice dinner, but they also agreed to kind of stay apart too, but it was nice to see it reconciled, so excuse me, Ellen.
yeah, sometimes I agree. Sometimes reconciliation doesn't mean that you continue to have a close relationship. It's just that you heal a breach and then you go your separate ways, it seems to me. Darlene?
You're on, Darlene.
Okay, thanks. I kind of just need to listen today. I'm taking a break from cleanup. I'm just glad to be here with you guys and not out in the yard.
Glad that you're here with us. Do you want to call on the next person to share?
Yes, I'm not sure who has shared. How about Jane?
Perfect.
I found me thinking about your sermons on reconciliation, and what Ellen said was that reconciliation doesn't always mean that you're going to stay together, be together, or you form a relationship. And then what you said about Rosh Hashanah, and what our Jewish brothers and sisters do during the 8 days before Yom Kippur. And I thought, what a nice thing to do, and what an important thing, not just nice, but important. I'm always fascinated by the culture and the practices, like you build this little temple or shrine with stone, and you have a holy stone and you bless the stone, and then you go on. And it is fascinating to me. I thought it was interesting. I have a boss that talks about putting a bow on things when you're ending a big discussion. And the story about Esau and Jacob burying their father kind of put a bow on their relationship. You know, they came together and then they were apart. And then the next thing you know, a couple chapters later, they're burying their father and together. And that kind of, for me, that kind of put a bow on that relationship.
Thank you. Do you want to invite the next person? I think there's Kay and Mary yet to go.
Kay.
I'm going to throw out something that concerned me. The part about Jacob after the rape of his daughter Dinah, and the brothers were very upset about the honor, and Jacob seemed to be more concerned about his relationship with the Canaanites than he did the honor of his daughter. So that was something that just kind of bothered me a little bit. Mary?
Hold on, I'm coming. Hold on. Hey y'all. I'm listening halfway. I have a school deadline, but I did get to read this week everything. And so I guess my to piggyback on what you just said about Dinah, I liked how in the comments it said that like the ambiguity of sin and its consequences is just left there for us to think about. And it made me think about sort of the even in like fast forward to the New Testament and Jesus, I guess I think it's the Pharisees, they want to stone the woman at the well, you know, and he says, you know, let ye without sin be the first to cast the stone. And so there's sort of this tension of like, wait, is Jesus saying that we don't follow the law. Like we don't give her what we think the law says she deserves. So yeah, so sort of just, is it our, are we left with that so that we have to use, like Mike said this maybe a couple weeks ago, like no rigid rules, like really having to discern and have wisdom about what is the right thing to do in this case. So that totally triggered that. I like that. And then another thing that I liked was in the story of Laban and Jacob. There's God appears to Jacob and a dream tells him to leave. But then God also, and maybe you already said this, God also appears in a dream to Laban and talks to him. And just this idea of like, what was that relationship between God and, Laban, and sort of thinking like Laban wasn't like I know y'all are saying Laban, I don't know how to pronounce it, but, was he a Jew? No, I don't think he was. I don't think Laban was a Jew. I'm not sure. But the idea of like the Jewish God, the Hebrew God coming in and speaking in a dream to somebody else. And that just was curious to me. And that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Jane, please.
Is it because women were seen as chattel and, lower than low person on the totem pole in the family structure, that Jacob and David, are they just bad fathers? Jacob and David don't go after or punish the person who rapes their daughter. It's up to the brothers to do, or the brothers take it upon themselves. But I didn't know if that had to do with the family structure or just a weakness in these two men. And I'm sure it happened more often than these two men.
Yeah, thank you. Really great questions all around. Okay, maybe some observations, if it's okay. And by the way, always push back, raise your hand if I'm bothering you. Lila asked one. I've got to tell you, having wrestled in college and high school, like this is like a big story for me. And you've heard me preach on it before, probably. I actually feel like very, very qualified to speak about this incident, having studied it and wrote a paper on it in a doctoral level class in Emory. This is a bizarre story, Jacob wrestling with this thing. And it's really important to hear the text never says what it is. So Jacob says, I've seen the face of God, but if you trace the story out, and we read it, when he sees Esau, he says, seeing your face is like seeing the face of God. And that might be intentional. Like it seems like there's a real tension in the story. Like, is this an angel? Is this a thief? Is this God? Is this his brother Esau? Now, having wrestled before, it's a really curious story, because belt wrestling is a really, really old sport in the ancient Near East, where people would wear a belt and try to subdue the other person. A lot of commentators say that this is like a river spirit that is like threatening Jacob crossing the Jabbok. So he has to like defeat the spirit to cross the Jabbok, right? Maybe you've heard me say this before. What's really strange about the story is there's this really weird move, and Jacob's hip gets put on a joint, right? And it's hard to know if that's his hip or not. In Hebrew, it reads the kaf yerko, which is like the palm of his hip. And I've told you before, Hebrew uses a lot of euphemisms. So on the one hand, this could be his hip. And here's an origin story of why Hebrew people don't eat hip meat, right? That's kosher. You don't eat the hip meat. On the other hand, the palm of your hip could be a euphemism for his groin. And it's very possible that the wrestler puts Jacob's groin out of socket. Hence he limps. And by the way, Jacob doesn't seem to have any kids after this. I know you're thinking, oh, Rachel gives birth to Benjamin. Well, yeah, but she's already pregnant, right? So Jacob's groin really could be put out of socket in this incident I want to share. That is a strange thing to do in a wrestling match, because typically that boomerangs on you when you hit an opponent in the groin. Usually that inspires wrath instead of encouraging capitulation. We don't know how the match goes. I mean, the opponent could just be absolutely beating the tar out of Jacob, but Jacob won't let go. And I'd like you to consider Jacob means heel grabber. I mean, Jacob is possibly holding on to the heel of this entity who has beat him to a bloody pulp, but the entity will not let him, I mean, he won't let the entity away, whoever it is. And the story seems to thrive on that ambiguity. Like Jacob cannot see who this is, because that would ruin the story. If it's God and Jacob sees God face to face, he'll die. If it's his brother, mystery out of the bag. If it's the spirit, you know what I mean? So there's like intentional ambiguity. And so the thing, whatever it is, says, let me go. And Jacob says, I won't let you go until you bless me. And here goes Jacob trying to steal a blessing. Now, this is really interesting because in Hebrew, the word bless can also be translated as curse. So maybe you know the story in Job. Job's wife says to Job, why do you persevere in keeping your integrity? Curse God and die. She uses this word in Hebrew, it's the word barak, and it could be translated actually, bless God and die. Job's response is, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And Job could just as well have said, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Cursed be the name of the Lord. Your text doesn't give you that. I mean, I'm an expert on this word. I do want to say, right? I'm not an expert on everything, but I'm an expert on this one. And so like what's happened is your Bible translator has tried to interpret this in a way that makes sense to them. But I want to suggest to you the ambiguity could happen, because if you read the rest of the book of Job, right? Job has a lot of negative things to say about God. And when you consider that Jacob gets a new name and a new identity, he goes from being heel grabber, that is like used car salesman or thief, supplanter. His new name is tries to steal from God. Is that a blessing or is that a curse? It's an interesting question, I think, right? And it makes me think like, what would have happened if Jacob had just let go? And I think about this spiritually. Again, you've heard me talk a lot about gifts versus investments. I think a lot of times spiritually, we try to get stuff out of God instead of just like receiving what God would like to give us. So I wonder what would happen if we just let God go. Sometimes we get a new name and it may not be better. That's what I want to point out in this story. So it's really, really bizarre. Like I say, the text, I think, leaves open that this could be Esau. Because again, later, Jacob says, seeing your face, Esau, is like seeing the face of God. And I will tell you, having wrestled, I'm not sure you're always wrestling an opponent. I think sometimes you're wrestling yourself and the opponent. And I'll tell you, having wrestled, which I believe to be like the most demanding sport that there is, which is both anaerobic and aerobic at the same time, I sort of think every wrestling match you are in fact wrestling God as well, if you're serious about this. So having coached wrestling, we did say this is God's only sport, which is the case. God enters the sports field one time in the Bible, this is it, and then hangs up the shoes. I don't know what this means, but you know, when you see the face, when you hear the word face, a face is both literal, but it also figuratively represents the wholeness of somebody's being, which is why a human can't see God's face. we could take that literally, but I think figuratively it's saying a human being cannot like comprehend all of God, or you would just die. If you tried to take on all the transcendence of the universe, it would blow your mind and your heart, essentially. So again, we get real literal, and you're going to get to find out. The text ends up being really funny when we get to Exodus, and you'll see it. Moses can't see God's face, so he gets to look at God's back, right? And the story is clear. We get to see where God's already going. We're not taking leadership. But the text also says that Moses talks to God face to face. So you get to hear both things as the Bible unfolds. And again, the wrestling story is really, really strange. And to think that this is the moniker of the people tries to wrestle or wrench things from God. If you read the text, that is true. And I would suggest to you, we do that too, to our detriment, not to our benefit. Question about places. So Bethel's an interesting story because it's clearly a shrine. And when you read the text, this is not just in the middle of the wilderness. Jacob goes to a pagan shrine. There's like a ziggurat there already. And then he has a vision that the ziggurat is going up to where like God lives. The surprise is that God is both there and where Abraham was. So in like the sort of when you've got a pantheon of gods, it seems really clear in the Hebrew Bible that gods have geography. Like the gods of Egypt only have jurisdiction in Egypt. Once you get across the Nile, they don't have jurisdiction anymore. You'll really find this out when you read Kings. After the exile of the northern tribes, there's like lions that come out and start killing people. And the Assyrians are like, oh, the gods of the land are really mad, so we need to satisfy the gods of the land. And again, the idea, right, when you're polytheist, is there's always room for more gods, and there may not be like one ultimate god, or even if so, there's like territorial regional deities. So Jacob's surprised that the God of his grandpa is outside the land of Canaan. And that seems really fair to me, right? You get the origin story of the name Peniel. Now people who went to Jordan, Tim and Graciela, John and Herb, we went to Peniel. I got a photo of it hanging in my office. Instead of seeing the sunrise, we saw the sunset, and we kind of were there by accident. It was over there by Jerash. I don't know if you guys remember. Gorgeous sunset, truly gorgeous. And like, that's the place where the story unfolds. I do think, to Tim's point, right, there's this resistance conversation in the Hebrew Bible, like, hey, does God just live in the temple, or is God everywhere? And remember, before the temple gets built, in fact, like we're going to read this, God says, don't build a temple. Take a tabernacle all around, because I don't live in one spot, like I'm everywhere. And in some ways, the temple is a betrayal of the Torah. I told you this before. It's like David's idea, and David wasn't a Hebrew, he's a Jebusite. So what he does is he takes Jebusite religion, which is temple-centric, and confines Hebrew religion into a temple, which is against it's against the Torah. But somehow, like, we decided he could do that. Most Christian people I know say, of course, God lived in the temple. But again, I would invite you to reread the Torah. The answer is God does not live in a temple. I want to challenge the reconciliation story. I don't think Jacob ends up reconciled with Laban or Esau. I think Jacob, he can only see what he is. And so because he is untrustworthy, he trusts nobody else. I think what he does with Laban is he makes a truce. And basically he does what you do with small children. You stay on my side of the back seat and I'll stay on my side. Here's the line, don't cross it. And if he were to cross it, it's clear Laban's going to like attack him. And now both people cheat each other, right? So Laban cheats him out of, like, essentially 7 years out of work. And Jacob, we don't know how this works. He cheats Laban out of the sheep. And again, I'm going to tell you, this is non-scientific. This is like gobbledygook how he does it. So here that the Bible's not a science textbook. If you put shade over sheep, they're not going to be spotted. Like that's like Lamarckianism, which we all know is ridiculous. But it doesn't matter the factuality, just the trickster gets tricked. That's sort of how this ends up playing out. And you'll notice that Laban is not a monotheist because he's got teraphim, which are like household gods, and his own daughter steals them, like steals the power of her father and then defiles it with her menstruation. So this is a really earthy, bizarre story. When Jacob sees Esau, I want to suggest to you, Esau seems really interested in reconciling with his brother. But notice that Jacob's like, no, just keep going, or like, we'll have dinner. But as the story plays out, of course, Esau is the nation of Edom, and Jacob is the nation of Israel, and they never do get along. So this is like a family origin story about how the red folks who live in Wadi Rum don't get along with their sibling Jacob. And it's based on enmity. And I want to suggest to you that because Jacob is so untrustworthy, he's going to presume everybody else is too. So I actually would caution us from this kind of reconciliation, which I read to be truce making and not reconciliation. You're okay. I'm okay if you disagree with that read. I don't see sibling unity here.
Yes, I think you're right. And Ellen, I think maybe said some of the same thing, but while they agree, maybe don't become best friends, you at least know they've improved and left their relationship in an improved way. And I think that's good. It
seems fair that they at least make a boundary, right? So that there's not like warfare, but there's a boundary. And as you read the history, that boundary is going to get crossed on both sides. Now, I've got to say, I find it easier to reconcile with friends than with family. I don't know about you all, right? And there's many quotes on that, right? Like, hey, friends are God's apology for family. I've also read that dogs are God's apology for family, and friends and dogs are about the same. So you do what you want with that.
What I see them doing is changing their behavior and not their hearts. They've agreed to not beat up each other, but they're still distrustful of each other and angry.
And I want to say, I actually see Esau willing to change his heart, and I see Jacob rejecting that. Esau is going to get a really bad rap when you read the Bible. Like when you read Paul, the quote is, Jacob I've loved and Esau I hated. And clearly, if we take that literally, that's not really great. But I don't see Esau as such a bad guy. I mean, yeah, he marries a Canaanite person, but a lot of that is inspired by like the unhealthy relationship he has with his parents, right? I mean, it's like, it's sort of bizarre. Wells are important. Remember last time I suggested to you that when you see a well, you should hear in your head a wedding bell. And I read a really interesting commentary on Jesus and the Samaritan woman, right? Which is that Jesus is essentially flirting with this lady. And when Jesus talks about living water, that's really flirtatious and possibly off color. Now, you may not like that reading, but what happens is this, like, again, there's no wedding there, and like reading it in this flirty way allows you to like transform the situation from a into something that's comedic, actually. I mean, in the Shakespearean way. It may not be funny, but like it's got this turnaround, and that sure does happen in the story. The rape story is interesting because it's not really clear that rape is the right word. In Hebrew, the word is shakav, which means to lay down together. Now, the Bible is really great about avoiding, the Bible is really good with like our puritanical roots. The Bible loves euphemisms, especially in Hebrew. So there's no word like had sexual intercourse. Usually you get either lay down together or you get knew one another, right? Like just the word like to get to know. So there's some ambiguity about what happens here. You can read Anita de Diamant's novel called The Red Tent, which suggests this might have been a mutual relationship. And there's no reason to preclude that, because remember in the Bible, the way you get married is, in fact, you have sex with somebody and then you pay the bride price. So please don't think that there was a chuppah and stomping on a glass. That was not happening. That's like a much more modern tradition that our Hebrew brothers and sisters practice. What's interesting, right, is that the sons use the sign that they cut these people into the covenant and then they kill them. It would be like baptizing somebody and shooting them like immediately, right? So you're like baptizing them, which is this great entry into the house of God. And like while the water's dripping in their eyes, you kill them. I mean, that's essentially it, right? This is like religious practice malappropriated. And what's curious is that the boys who do this are not going to get any land. Jacob's worried about his reputation. He doesn't do much other than complain, but on his deathbed, he curses them. Talk about dysfunctional. He waits till he can have the last word. And one of the boys who does this is, of course, Levi, who, what do you know? All the priests come from him. And it may help you to know that not only are priests like these dodgy people, but priests essentially were butchers. They slaughtered meat, and that's what Levi does. He slaughters these people. So this is like real sketchy, by the way. Really sketchy. And it is curious that Jacob seems more worried about his reputation than the loss of his daughter, although remember that daughters are property. Shechem seems very willing to pay the bride price. So maybe the issue is that he's Canaanite, although let's keep in mind that Laban is a polytheist too. And so is Jacob, because remember when Jacob gets to the promised land, he tells his kids, put the other gods away, which doesn't mean stop believing in them. It just means put them away. They don't have jurisdiction in this land.
That's right. Well, as Tim said the other day, the Hebrews aren't monotheists at this point, because they do talk about other gods. They just think their God is above all others.
Yeah, and that word, if you're interested, I'll put it in the chat, is the word henotheism, which is dedicating yourself to one God, even though there may be others. So it's likely Abraham is a henotheist.
So Mike,
yeah,
you don't deny other gods. You just dedicate yourself to just one.
Yeah, and that really applies, John, when you've got this idea that gods are territorial. So when you're living in the territory of Baal, then that's who you're going to put your devotion to. And we know, I mean, if you've read James Nichener's book, The Source, right? I mean, there's all kinds of what we call idolatry. I mean, the Bible calls it idolatry, happening all over the land of Israel. There's these little Asherah statues, which essentially are like headless, big-breasted women. And there's also the Asherah pole, which is either like a stone plinth or actually a tree. And I don't want to sketch you out, but that seems to be a phallic symbol about impregnating the earth and making it fertile. There's this other weird stuff, like when you read about these stones that they set up and anoint, and they call them Ebenezers. Ebenezer means stone of my helping. And it's does that commemorate where God helped, or is that like an idol? It's sort of hard to know. A lot of times we read this, we retroject monotheism into these passages, and I want to suggest we do that to our detriment. There's no real monotheism until 540 at the earliest, which is when the people return from the exile to Babylon. John, please.
Somewhat off topic, but I have a question. You mentioned earlier that the Hebrew word barak either means curse or blessing.
Yeah.
Now, we had a president whose name was Barak, but I think that was probably more Muslim than it was Hebrew. So my question would be in the I guess the Muslim tradition, what does that word mean?
I think it means the same thing. I'm not an Islamic scholar, but I'll tell you, Arabic is also a Semitic language. So consider that in Hebrew you say shalom, and in Arabic you say salam. So actually, if you have a good command of Hebrew, there's a lot of like, Arabic cognates, similar to like if you were to speak Spanish and Portuguese. And I don't remember which way is easier. Like Portuguese understands Spanish, but most people who live in Spain don't understand Portuguese. So like, I don't remember which way that works. Herb, I see you're set.
Again? Repeat your question.
No, I see you mic'd up, so you got something to offer.
Well, it's yeah, just a question more than anything. It's hard to know, the genesis of the Hebrew people. Okay, and I'll say that because it's a little confusing, because you can say, oh well, that's Abraham, he's the father. And by the way, they're not Jews at this point. I think you can only really refer to them as Hebrews, but I believe that may change later. But if you remember, then all the sons of Noah, all these Semites and Luddites, and and then the two daughters sleep with their father, and then they're being the Moabites and whatever else. And then later in Genesis and Exodus, they're fighting these people, but are they Hebrews too? Or and why? Who's in and who's out? It's not really very clear. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Mike.
No, it's really interesting. I put this in the chat, right? The word Jew actually comes from the tribe of Judah, which is the southern kingdom, the one southern kingdom. The 10 tribes in the north, they end up being wiped out by Assyria. We don't really hear the word Jew until the Babylonian exile, and it's a geographic term. So like when you read the Gospel of John and you hear like the Jews wanted to kill Jesus, it's referring to people who live in Judah, who may be of any kind of religious ilk, actually, likely not Romans, but could be. So there's just a lot of ambiguity. A lot of scholars will tell you that like Hebrew comes from the word Hapiru, and the Hapiru is like this sort of ethnic tribe that existed in Canaan. A lot of scholars don't see a lot of evidence for a mass exodus like from Egypt that's described in Exodus. Some people say these could be the Hyksos. I mean, we don't really know where these folk come from. It's very possible that there was a group that came out of Egypt, but that there certainly was this other group of people within the land of Canaan that they sort of joined up with. And so like we use all these words kind of ambiguously, but again, like Jew doesn't have a religious valence until like the Common Era. And so like all you can really say is like, you can say these are Hebrew people. And then when the nation split, you can call them Israel in the north, and you can call them Judah in the south, right? Or Judeans. But all of this is very imprecise.
Right. And even when the Hebrew people were taken to Babylon, some were, some weren't. Those that came back, I don't think they considered those that stayed to be Jews, if you will.
Absolutely not. There's a whole lot of like classism going on there. And they're called the people of the land. Well, I mean, the people who stayed back thought they were being faithful religiously. And then here come these like city folk telling them they didn't do a good enough job and basically excluding them.
Yes, because you had the impression the Babylonians took the
Best and brightest.
more educated, if you will,
Yeah.
and left the farmers behind or something,
Essentially, that's right. They left the unskilled laborers behind. Yeah. Yeah, I was talking to Tim about Reuben, and what's interesting is Reuben is the first son, so he should be the one who gets all the goods. But Reuben disqualifies himself, curiously enough, by sleeping with one of his father's concubines. So the story actually tells you a little bit about like enmity between the tribes. Reuben's a pun because it means like son of seeing. Remember that Leah had beautiful eyes, and Jacob thought he was marrying Rachel, but he married Leah. Hence, we pull the veil back in the wedding ceremony now, right? That really is the etiology of the veil. And so like what's interesting is like Reuben is much like his dad, but because he sleeps with his father's concubine, he can't be the preeminent tribe, and that's going to be Judah. You also get to hear like, hey, Jacob has 11 sons and one daughter, Dinah. Now, girls really can't be matriarchs. And just to make that really clear, her status is like really confounded with this incident with Shechem. So Dinah is not going to like be a tribe. And as we follow through, what happens is, I don't know if you've noticed, there's no tribe of Joseph. It ends that Joseph doesn't get a blessing, his two kids do, Ephraim and Manasseh. So essentially, Joseph's two kids replace him and Dinah, and that's how you get to 12 boys. Now, a lot of people will tell you that like some of the tribes are not related. Like the tribe of Dan seems to not actually be like a blood relative to Jacob. It seems to be like a Canaanite tribe. It's just got like different etiology and different customs, it seems. But we do get them all woven together where we've got this 12 tribes later. There's a lot of irony in these names because Levi means my heart. And look at the heart of Levi. It's like tricking people into the covenant and killing them. So this is Jacob's heart. He is a thief and a trickster at heart. And at heart, the priests are butchers. I mean, this is like, it's just rich with irony and puns and frankly, sadness.
So Mike, were these characteristics held in esteem in the ancient world? It would seem that maybe that's why, maybe they were.
It's super hard to tell. It seems like
a hero. These were heroes.
Yeah, it seems like, Lila, there is like some kind of support that some kind of revelry, and it could be because the Hebrew tribe is not particularly strong or numerous, that they find consolation in trickery. And the story is peppered with that, right? Abraham tries to trick Abimelech and Pharaoh. Isaac does that. Jacob is just full of tricks, right? And so like this theme of the trickster and the trickster being tricked, a lot of scholars have pulled that out, and perhaps it's like a core identity for these ancient people who essentially were in a very small buffer zone, like the size of Delaware, between two like huge world empires, Egypt and Mesopotamia. And so just to be clear, the Hebrews have always been, like in the Hebrew Bible anyway, technologically inferior to their neighbors. The Philistines had Iron Age technology. The Hebrews were in the Bronze Age, which means the Philistines had like at least weak iron swords and chariots. The Hebrews had boards with like bronze nails sticking out of them. I mean, they were fighting with clubs while their neighbors had like spear points. So they were fighting with stone tools. And I've mentioned this before, the Hebrews were really late in figuring out how to ride a horse. They didn't know that you could put a bridle in a horse's mouth. The Mesopotamians figured that out a long time before the Hebrews did. They thought horses could just pull carts, and if you put stuff in their mouth, they'd suffocate, because that's what happens to oxen. They breathe through their mouth, but horses breathe only through their nose, which is why you can put a bit and bridle in their mouth without killing them. lest it seems like I'm making that up, when the Assyrians come down to fight them in a rebellion, they say to the Hebrew people, hey, we'll give you like a whole bunch of horses, as if you could even ride them. Philistines, remember, are Greeks. They come from like Minoan civilization. So they're bringing like Iron Age technology to people in the Bronze Age. And as you know, bronze is like not very abundant on the face of the planet. So the only people with bronze stuff are like the gentry, and everybody else is fighting with like obsidian arrowheads, flint knives.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
What does the Midrash and the rabbis say about these themes?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, basically, they just trace out what I'm familiar with is they just trace out the dysfunction of the family. But, you know, like the scriptures do that too. It just takes a little bit of attention to see, right? Like, you know, I mean, like, why is Jacob cursing his children? And why are his children cutting people into a covenant with God and then like cutting their throats? You know, like this is the kind of thing that the rabbis notice and don't appreciate. It's weird because Dinah, which means judgment, has a brother named Dan. Those are the same word, right? Dan and Dinah. And Dan means something like judge or to judge. So like, why are you naming two kids Judgment or Judging? Like that's weird. My mom's named Dinah, by the way. There's also this weirdness I want to draw out now about the dysfunction of the kids. If I asked you who Jacob's favorite child is, who would you say? Lila, I think I read your lips to say Joseph.
Joseph.
Yeah.
Benjamin Joseph.
Yeah, it's definitely Benjamin. And I want to tell you why. Benjamin means son of my right hand. This is really ironic because Benjamin is the youngest of all the kids, but that follows that the youngest is the favorite. But we read the story, it's Joseph, he gets the coat of many colors. We don't know what Benjamin gets, but the son of your right hand is your heir. You know, when we say the creed that Jesus is seated at which hand of the Father? It's not literal. Your right hand is like the hand of your power. Your left hand, as many of you know, is like your wiping hand. So you don't want to be left-handed. And if like the son of your left hand would be like the redheaded stepchild. And nobody has that name, by the way. But textually speaking, Benjamin seems to be the preferred child, even over Joseph.
So Mike, isn't that upside down, backwards from what we think the tradition was of some kind of primogeniture? I mean,
but all of these stories are resisting that, because notice that Esau is not going to be the one who carries the blessing. It's Jacob who's the younger.
I find these very confusing, Mike, and hard to pull out a takeaway.
Now, it's really strange. Like the whole concept of primogeniture seems to be constantly like enforced and then challenged and then enforced and challenged. And again, it's hard to know, is this a commentary that like, again, the Hebrew people are like the redheaded stepchildren compared to their Canaanite neighbors who are much more advanced than they are? Hard to know. You know, there's this long genealogy of Esau, and that was probably like too long, didn't read for you. But I do just want to pull out that there's two relatives of Esau that become really important. One of them is this guy called Ruel, which is like God sees, actually. And that is one of the names appended to Moses's father-in-law. He's alternately called Ruel, Jethro, and Hobab. it's hard to know if those are three people that have been woven together into one, or if the guy just had to have a bunch of very strange and different nicknames. But Ruel seems to be descended from Esau, according to that genealogy. The other is that there's this guy called Beor, and Beor is going to be Balaam, the prophet for hire, who's hired to curse the Hebrew people down the road and blesses them instead. You hear curse and blessing wrapped up in that same word, Barak.
Mike?
Yeah.
I'm somewhat curious about the history of that time when the 10 tribes Israel are absorbed, if you will, into Babylon, and then when they come back to Judea, how many come back, and did it really happen that way?
Well, yeah, actually that part we've got historical verification for, or as much as we can. Two come back, Judah and Levi. And remember that there's within the tribe of Levi, there's essentially two kinds of folks. There's the priests, those are called the Kohen in Hebrew, hence the last name Cohen. If you meet somebody with the last name Cohen, then theoretically they're a descendant of Aaron. And then the Levites are descendants of Moses. And they're all from the same family, right? But the Levites aren't priests. There's like classes of service.
So the Cohens and the Levites come back from Babylon.
The Levites and the Judeans.
And the well,
like the tribe of Judah. There's only two tribes left, Levi and Judah.
Right. Well, I mean, in the south, there are 10 tribes.
Okay. In the north, yeah.
The north. And then, so what the Babylonians do is they come in and they remove the scholars from the tribe of Judea and Levi.
Yeah.
And then the only people who come back out of the 10 tribes are those from Judea and Levi.
Yeah, actually the Assyrians wiped out the other 10. So in 722, the Assyrians took over the nation of Israel, comprising the 10 tribes, interspersed them with like Hittites, Amalekites to kind of make this cultural melting pot that was very much forced. And then we call those the lost 10 tribes. The Book of Mormon, if you're curious to know, identifies the Native Americans as the lost 10 tribes. And it might do your soul well to know that Jesus Christ appears to them in the Book of Mormon.
So the 10 tribes are absorbed before Judea the Judeans are taken from Judah and to the north.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. To give you dates, consider the 10 tribes of Israel disappear 722, and then the Babylonian exile not really totally done till 589. That's when they all go to Babylon. They don't come back till 540 with Ezra and Nehemiah.
Got it. Okay. Thanks.
All this is like factual stuff. I'm wondering how it's hitting you.
Well, I always believe that there's theology within the story, and that the story was sort of developed so that they could take this theology or teach their descendants this theology. But some of these stories, it's hard to see the theology in it. So, I've probably proved myself wrong. Like the wrestling, what's the point of the wrestling? And there must be, but there's various stories that you just go, what's the point?
Well, I'd like to say the wrestling story to me is really important because I think the theology of it is like, what are we trying to build out of God? And what if we just let go? What if instead of like trying to take something, we could just receive it? I mean, that to me is like the difference between God, the Mediterranean bizarre swap meat deity, and God the giver.
But do you think some way to wrestling, God blesses, even though he wrestles with God, God blesses him at the end, so he looks like he wins. It was, the message could be, we should wrestle with God.
I'm just not sure he gets a blessing in the end. And I think like when we approach grace as something that has to be earned or as an investment, I'm pretty sure we don't actually win.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I see this as a really big struggle, Herb, like in my own spiritual journey, is like actually receiving a gift from God. And I just want you to consider, right, that like in the prayer book, I can withhold communion from somebody for pastoral reasons. And I just think that's ludicrous. I mean, that's a mean of social control. I can excommunicate you, so you'll do what I want you to do. I don't know. It's sort of like we talk about like, hey, well, if you don't have the right intention, you can like defile yourself. Really? I mean, like, does God like rely on our intentions to give us grace? Like, isn't that how grace is different from other stuff? Like, it's always good for us? I don't know.
Mike?
Yeah.
And Herb, I don't know about you, or anybody else on the call, but I think I often wrestle with God.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that's sort of built in, and I think we just do that. And maybe that's what this story is all about.
Yeah, I think the question, John, I mean, I really appreciate that that's descriptive. I think the question is like, how do we, frankly, not like, how do we win? I think it's how do we stop?
What would cause us to stop?
I think recognition about who God is. I mean, I think Jacob sees God as either an adversary or like a hoarder, and you've got to like get stuff out of God. And look, if I'm really honest, like some of those opinions underlie some of what I do and think. And so I'm just going to give you another thing, right? Like I might have mentioned this to you before. Somebody asked me like, what's the moral rule about like sexuality and abortion? And according to nonviolent communication, right, once you make a rule like that, then you've got terms for punishment, and you can say you broke the rule, you deserve to be punished. And I mean, do people deserve to be punished, or is it appropriate to offer rehabilitation? Because those are real different things, rehabilitation and punishment. Right. And like, to be honest, like we grew up that hell is the worst place, but then like we would tell people like go to hell, and like, that's just really strange, like why would we ever like say that to somebody else and then believe like they deserve it? Like, I would pull this kernel out. Like if we think that like Adolf Hitler deserves to go to hell, I think we need to wrestle with ourselves a little bit more. Because how can anybody deserve an eternity of torment for something they do that's only temporal? Look, I get the guy did some bad stuff, but it had an event horizon to it. I mean, that's where actually like the doctrine of purgatory is a lot more gracious than only two options.
An empty place.
Because purgatory is temporal. You pay your dues and then you get out. But to say like people deserve to be punished is just like really, really tough. And look, it goes both ways. Like I know people who think Joe Biden deserves to go to hell, and I know people who think Donald Trump deserves to go to hell. And like if you find yourself believing either one of those things as your priest, I would say like you should pray on that. Because I just don't think that's okay. Like I don't think that's the gospel.
Hell is an empty place.
No, there's a church there. It's really pretty. I mean, that's just the funny thing, right? Like, like I think like, I mean, did God make hell or did human beings make that? I mean, I think that's a really good theological question.
Well, I think that John Hick would say in his book, Evil and the God of Love, that everyone gets rehabilitated at the end.
I mean, if we're not hoping for that, again, we need some rehabilitation. I got to be honest, because what's curious, right, is like even our Jewish brothers and sisters. I mean, there's some sects that believe it, but over the majority don't believe in an afterlife of any kind. Nor do they believe that like people who committed atrocities like pogroms are going to be punished eternally. I'm not trying to say these places aren't real. I'm just saying, like, let's consider theologically where they take us. Because when people deserve punishment, I think that informs how we treat our neighbor and how we treat ourselves. And yeah, John.
I don't want to put you on the spot so you can say, I'm not going to answer this question, but have you had these kind of discussions with your brother?
We don't discuss things real well, John. I mean, I'm not blaming anybody, but there's a lot of the like adversarial tones to our relationship. We try to iron those out, but it's tough,
I just wondered since he is Orthodox Jew now, and of course you're an Episcopal priest, whether there was not a discussion so much, but this is what I think, or this is what we think. And I mean, I know what he was raised like you in the tradition you were raised, but he made a decision to change. I just wondered if, obviously, what you're saying is there is no conversation.
I mean, I can ask him stuff sometimes. And I'm fine saying this. Like, again, I think part of the way we grew up is that like the dialogue I almost feel like is always tinged, like it's just, we have a hard time discussing stuff, like I just give you an example. So Emery went to a Jewish preschool, and this was to ramp her up into school. And on Friday, they had a program for little ones called Tat Shabbat. And we were the only Gentiles in Tat Shabbat. And I went every week and I learned all these Hebrew songs, which we sing here at St. Thomas on Fridays. So I teach our kids Hebrew songs, and including like the blessings at the table. So there's a blessing for the challah and for the candles and for the kiddush, that silver cup of wine, right? And I've been to my brother's house and they only say those. And I was like, hey, have you heard the song? And he was like, no, and we're not singing that. I was like, well, okay, then, I mean, that's just sort of like where we are. Sometimes we get some traction because he gave me a couple volumes of the Gemara. And sometimes I'll ask like, hey, it's Yom Kippur or it's Rosh Hashanah. And like, how are you practicing that? And we get real, the answer tends to be defensive. I'm not going to blame my dad, but like he raised us to compete with one another for his affection. And so I think we haven't figured that out. And maybe because there were 10 of them, my dad had 10 brothers and sisters, maybe he felt real competitive. So he gave us what he had. I mean, I don't know, but we don't do super well. I mean, I'll tell you, I love, and I'm talking about it in church. I love the tradition of Rosh Hashanah. They've got Christians beat on Lent. Like, we suck at Lent. We do this like dumb stuff where we like try to curry favor with God by making ourselves miserable. It's ridiculous. Like our Jewish brothers and sisters are like, let's fix our broken relationships. And like, in fact, we better do that. To me, that's admirable. I know Christians who do that in Lent. It's just that the tradition has like, by and large, become like, hey, like, let's show God how much we love God by depravity. It's just like unfortunate, because that's not what Lent was meant to do. Lent was meant to prepare you for entrance into the community through the same reconciliation that our Jewish brothers and sisters do.
So Mike, I love that you talked to us about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which starts at dusk tonight.
Yeah, when you can see 3 stars in the sky is when the Jewish day begins. So I'd calculate that around 7:57.
So I have found this very meaningful as well. And I have a good friend who is Jewish and really enjoy keeping up with these with her.
Yeah.
And they are very meaningful. And so today is, we have this nice discussion on alienation and reconciliation that's very timely that Yom Kippur is starting this evening. So in our chapter, Into the World, talks about offering tokens of reconciliation this week in the family, the church family, the neighborhood. And I'm not quite sure how to do that other than to talk to, I have two friends in particular that I feel our relationship is, I mean, it's not completely broken, but it certainly could use a little attention. And so that's kind of on my mind. I'm not quite sure how to do it. I'm not quite sure how do we reach out in our own community of St. Thomas. It's a very nice moment to take an opportunity just to recognize our community and what binds us together, and maybe some things we could take a moment to improve or flesh out. I mean, I'm kind of flailing here, Mike, help me.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to remember, like, we often muddy our terms. Forgiveness takes one person, it doesn't take two. And forgiveness is not something you declare for someone else, it's a gift you give yourself. So we usually get that wrong. We usually say like, oh, I'm going to go forgive somebody. And sometimes we'll say like, oh, I forgive you. I want to suggest that's like not right. If you tell somebody you forgive them, it actually seems to be you've done the opposite thing. So forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, right? But it is like essentially what Anne Lamott says is giving up all hope of having had a different past. So I think forgiveness is when we say like, this thing has happened and I just accept what's happened. Doesn't mean I want a future with you. Reconciliation takes two people who both want a future together, and it's really messy. And I don't know what tokens of reconciliation are other than they are like palpable opportunities to build a future together. Now, it can be really, really hard. And AA, I think, is really, really great. AA says we go about looking for forgiveness, except when doing so makes things worse. And that happens sometimes, right? So I've had people say like, hey, I really want to forgive you. I'm going to forgive you for that time you did this and the time you did that. And they laundry list all this stuff. And I want to suggest that's not helpful for us building a future together. Now, if I ask for forgiveness for the time I did this and that, that's really different than somebody pronouncing it by like some kind of fiat. Lila, I just think it's really, really hard. And what's interesting, I think, when we read these chapters, these are like literal siblings, but these are also people groups jammed together. So, I mean, consider the way we could read this. These are like native Texans and Mexicans. These are people who live in Michigan, and these are people who live in Canada. These are people who live in the Gaza Strip, and these are people who live in Israel, and that's real. So what are the tokens of reconciliation? I mean, these are words that we usually call reparations is one thing. We could consider, our bishop calls them repairing the breach. So what would be a way to repair the breach in the West Bank? Offer reliable electricity, water, and trash pickup, which I can tell you if you live in the West Bank, you get none of those things. Doesn't mean you're going to be reconciled, but it's a token. Different from tokenism, I mean like a real marker that I would like to have some sort of peaceful future with you. Now, our Jewish brothers and sisters during Rosh Hashanah, they sometimes do get on a plane and go see each other. And I did that. Not because it was Rosh Hashanah, but I did that last week. And like, in order for me to do that effectively, which was like more than my wildest dream come true, it happened for me, I had to lay down outcomes and control. And it was enough to be able to say like, look, I want a relationship with you regardless of the choices you choose to make. often I think what we fail to realize is we feel a lot of tension, or we think like someone doesn't want to see us anymore, and they're thinking the same thing about us. So often when we show up for reconciliation, we're both surprised to find out we both wanted it all along. So like, I'll tell you, a really great token is an apology, which we're terrible at doing. Most of us are sorry that the other person's feelings got hurt, which is like a backstabbing apology. I'm sorry you're so emotionally brittle that you chose to be hurt by my flagrant betrayal of your trust. Right? You know, or sometimes we get so defensive that we refuse to apologize, knowing that, like, in general, no hurt is one person's fault, but we can always apologize for our part in something. And we can even use that language, right? Like, I want to apologize for my part in this rift. Like, I let this stew too long, or like, I took this so personally, and I'm not quite sure that's what you intended, and I'm going to apologize for my part in that.
I have a question. Well, I have lots of thoughts swimming in my head, and I want you to just tell me honestly if you're like, we already hashed that out, because as I said, I had to work on this school thing at the same time I was listening to y'all. But I was thinking about like the reconciliation with respect to Jesus. And I think, you know, my husband and I are like, we're kind of hashing out. My kids keep saying, you're like, y'all always fight about the Bible. And I'm just like, because it's very ambiguous. I'm so sorry, you know. But we're just sort of hashing out this idea of like Jesus as, you know, was Jesus. I know that y'all studied this before, like substitutionary atonement, you know, and so what we've always been taught is that Jesus was the way to reconcile us to God, that his death was necessary to reconcile us to God. That's what both of us have been taught. And so the idea of like reconciliation being made possible through Jesus. And then you were touching a little bit on the idea of, I think what I would say is like universal salvation, maybe is what you were touching on a bit. And you know, we even talked about Hitler this Sunday. My poor kids, they're like, oh my gosh, we all know. But we talked about this. We talked about the fact that like Hitler, like, do you think Hitler should be able to go and be with God eternally? And this the idea that there's no consequence, there's no eternal consequence for what we've done. And my idea was like, well, what about people who are brainwashed? What about people who are so brainwashed or so abused that they really didn't have any mental capacity to make the choice for salvation, like to choose Jesus, I guess, to choose belief and reconciliation? Would you put them in hell or whatever? But he pointed me to a text that's Jesus, it's the rich man and Lazarus, you know, and that just, it was confusing to me because I think that still right now in my faith, there's this tension between works and grace. And you look at this passage and the rich man has gone down to Hades. And I know we've talked about Hades a bit being like a city or something. I think you said it was, but what is that about? That like, why is that there? As far as like the rich man is like, go tell my family so that they know, so they don't wind up here with me, you know, because the rich man didn't give to the poor. He wasn't doing these works of justice, you know? Yeah. And so, yes, we are wrestling right now, trying to sort out how we present this very complex faith to our kids. And I need help. We need help, you know?
Well, I can't give you like the answer to
no, that's fine.
Questions, but a couple of thoughts, right? I mean, you know, to me, like the important thing about Jesus is the incarnation. I say like the fact that I was talking to somebody the other day who was like very concerned that like God didn't love them anymore because they did this habitual like sin, you know. And I don't know, like it just occurred to me to say like, hey, this core verse we all know and shows up at football games says God so loved the world that God gave. Loved and gave. The way I was taught to understand that is God like puts up with the world. God was so disappointed with the world that God sent Jesus. But I mean, like that like resists this core verse. Like, just like we are broken, wanton, whatever you want to put, God loves you like you are. That's the verse. And then Jesus isn't an investment. Jesus is a gift. And gifts are different from investments. See, I grew up hearing salvation's a gift, but you have to receive it. That's not the definition of a gift. A gift, once it's given, is out of the hand of the giver. So if God actually gives it, it's yours, whether you enjoy it or open it or not. It belongs to you. I think the hope is we will choose to enjoy it because it's more enjoyable. But I want to suggest to you, maybe Jesus didn't have to die for God. Maybe that's like the way we understand love, as God would go through the ringer. But I put before you, like, what if we didn't kill Jesus? Well, Mike, then all of us would go to hell. Really? The scriptures don't say that. I mean, nobody has to die for reconciliation to happen. I know because I've been reconciled with people and we're both alive. You know, I think like there's this opportunity to think about like, hey, Jesus showed up in this body not to like throw us a lifeline, because like Jesus loves embodiment.
But what about doesn't he present something, and I don't know the text as well, but in like the Last Supper, like, doesn't he present something about like, I have to do this, I have to go to the Father to make many rooms for you, like how, like I wrestle with that and like, okay, well that sounds like I've got to die. And then, you know, anyway, I don't know how do you fit that in within your understanding? I
mean, I think Jesus knew that when you resist the Roman Empire, there's a particular penalty you're going to pay, and he chose not to run away from that. Now, like, again, I just sort of think this is going to sound really crazy, but I have to ask you, what does God need? And like, needs and wants are different things, but if I'm really clear that God is omnipresent and omniscient and omnipotent, then God can't need anything. God cannot need anything. Otherwise, God's needy. So like, just even for example, like, I don't think God needs me to confess what I've done wrong. I think I need that.
Does God, so this is one thing that we go back and forth on, is does God need, my husband was bringing up debt, that sin creates a debt. You're so sweet. Sin creates a debt, and that debt has to be paid. So what is, sorry, this is coming from my very Protestant upbringing. So
no, that idea, by the way, I want to tell you, is not original. That idea is like only 1,000 years old, and it came from an attorney. Go figure, right? Like, attorneys are real interested in debt.
My husband's an attorney. He's like,
I'm married to one of those too, but she's much more gracious than I am, it turns out.
I'm an attorney too, but I don't fit well with
you know, actually, like, sin is not a debt. Sin is either a burden that's carried, or it's like essentially like a misfire. I mean, that's just what the word means. In Greek, it means like your tragic flaw, which is not always hubris. Like some people tragically give of themselves until there's nothing less. That's a tragic flaw. So, like, again, I think when you have to ask the question, like, well, doesn't God need to do something? I mean, just core principles seem to say, no, God doesn't need to do anything. Because if God needs stuff, then God's a dependent being instead of an independent being. The question is, like, what does God choose and what does God want? You know, and like, I want to be clear on Yom Kippur, which starts tonight. The most important thing is not the Holocaust. It's not. The most important thing is the Azazel, the scapegoat. And you can't kill that. Like if you kill the scapegoat, you get killed. The scapegoat symbolically gets all of the burdens that the people are carrying around, and then it gets driven out to exile. If you kill it, you're saying you reside here, you belong to us, like your life is in our community. When you drive it out, you're saying you have no place in this land or with these people, and the burdens that you're bearing are gone. Now, you didn't have to believe what I'm saying, but this is sort of how I deal with it. That rich man story that we're talking about, there's no understanding of eternal hell or heaven when that story is written. What seems to me really clear is that the rich man still thinks he's in charge of Lazarus. And he says, God, look, there's that like peasant. So send that peasant to us important people who are rich and have him. I mean, like the guy still hasn't figured out the Lazarus is not his property. He doesn't ask Abraham to go. He says, send that poor guy. And he doesn't even have a name. His name isn't rich man, it's money bags. The word is divs in Greek, and it means like money bags. So this is a story about a guy who has a real name and about money bags. And like, I could take it so literally, I forget to take it seriously. And I think the question is like, are poor people your property? Because they're at the bosom of Abraham. I mean, it appears that they've done something wrong or they're not important to God because you have more than they do, but that's just how it appears. Now, these are Abraham's children. There's a lot hung up in this, Mary, that like, and I want to be really fair. It's taken me like 20 years to kind of deprogram some of that. But like the way I try to deprogram some of it is just to be logical. And I don't read the Bible against itself. But again, the text says God loves the world, not God puts up with the world. Or like God has this core disappointment with the world. And Jesus was God's plan B. You know, like there's this theologian, maybe you've heard this guy, Duns Scotus. This is where we get the dunce cap from. And Duns Scotus said, hey, before the world was founded, the incarnation was already God's plan. So it wasn't plan B, it was plan A. And even if Adam and Eve hadn't eaten the fruit, Jesus was going to become incarnate. That was plan A. That makes a lot more sense to me, just honestly. It's more consonant with that read, God so loved the world. And sometimes it suggests to me that if I'm disappointed, like if I'm really disappointed, that says more about me than it says about God. I don't think accountability comes off the table. There's a difference between accountability and like dignity. But you know, like the way the US Constitution is organized is that everybody gets a trial. Even if we caught you red-handed, you get a trial. I mean, like the Constitution affords that to people. So like, shouldn't God be better than that? This is why I think we often like worship like the pettiest version of ourselves. Because to be honest, even when my kid wantonly disobeys me, I know better than to send my child to hell. If I know that and I'm not good, surely God knows that. Anyway, and what I'm doing is very Episcopalian. It's bringing reason into the equation, right? Because Episcopalians, we use scripture and we do use tradition, but we also use reason. And that's the three-legged stool. And if we pull one of those legs down, the thing falls over. John, you got your hand up? I definitely want to call you before we have to go.
Okay. Back to earlier part of this discussion, when it comes to reconciliation, if we believe reconciliation to me means that there was a breach. And if we are born sinners, we are born with the breach.
That's crazy. I mean, anybody who looks at a baby and says there's something fundamentally wrong with the baby, I would tell you there's something wrong with that person. I think that doctrine of stuff says more about us. You know, where it came from is Augustine looked at his infant son who always cried when he was hungry or sleepy or needed changing and said, look, the kid's born selfish. The other way to read that, right, is we've evolved to be dependent on one another as a social species. And that a kid who doesn't cry, it's because they've been neglected. They've been damaged by caregivers, right? Like crying is the way the baby communicates, tend to my needs. That's not selfish, that's called interdependence. So like this whole idea that we're born wrong or we're born evil is not a Jewish idea. It's not an early Christian idea. It's Augustine's idea. And Augustine was first a Neoplatonist and a Christian second. So in the Bible, there's no fall. We talked about that. There's no fall. And consider the doctrine. I mean, eating like a piece of fruit makes your sperm shrivel. That's just bizarre, John. And you may say, oh, I didn't believe that. That's the doctrine of original sin. That's what Augustine said happens. Bizarre. Bizarre. So I just think like, let's use Occam's razor and go with something more simplistic, right?
Why did Augustine win out? Because that is the story that is embedded in my brain and all of the children's books. Like that's where I'm just floundering right now. Because it's like,
because I think, Mary, and I was talking to my son about this one day, and I realized, and everybody's different on this, but like, there's a certain personality type that believes there's something wrong with me. And good news, there is something wrong with you. And here's how you fix it. The problem with my spiritual journey is accepting the Lord into my heart didn't fix all that stuff. Like it never did. I continued to think like God is disappointed in me or like whatever, you know, because I think like what's wrong with us is that we think there's something wrong with us. And we buy into this crazy thing, right? Like there's that verse, be holy as I'm holy, and it sometimes gets translated, be perfect as I'm perfect. And we sort of think like God's only pleased with perfection. By the way, that's the definition of perfectionism. And it, like any other ism, is really unhealthy. Like workaholism and alcoholism. Like, what do we think? Was Jesus a star quarterback? Was he able to spell backwards and forwards in 48 languages? Or did he have like acne and ingrown hairs? Did he stub his toe? Boy, I hope it's the latter, you know, because the scriptures say he was like us in every way. So look, if Jesus was perfect, he wouldn't like you because you're not. But if Jesus was holy, that's the different word, right? Holiness is about being extraordinary. And I'm very suspicious you function extraordinarily in a number of ways.
This is Herb. Can I make a comment? I think,
Please.
you know, I always look for the theology, and the most important theology in Genesis comes out of Genesis 1. Everything he created, he found good, and he made us in his image.
Yeah.
So,
and I want to circle back to one last thing, and then we'll have to quit. Only God can create. In the Bible, only God can create. Humans can make stuff, but we can't create, which means humans aren't powerful enough to change the inherent goodness of creation. All we can do is pretend it's not good, but we can't change the substance of goodness. That's very biblical theology. And by the way, that resists any doctrine of a fall. There goes all the demonology too. Unclean spirits are created beings. They can't possibly oppose God. They cannot oppose God at all. They can never win. They were made by the Creator. Yeah, we can go awry, but we can't change our fundamental goodness. What about evil people? Well, there's not evil people. There's people who do evil things. There's just people. Boy, that's hard to swallow. But not hard to swallow. If we could, we would love ourselves a lot better. And anyway, Brene Brown says the difference between being joyful and not is whether or not you believe people are doing the best they can with what they have. Now, I often think I wish people had more. I think that's okay to wish for, and this becomes part of our mission, right? But if you have to have more to be acceptable, I think we've gone the wrong way. If we share more so that we can enjoy life together, then I think this is like good news. Really enjoyed this, but I have to honor our time. So I'm going to call it quits. And hey, next week, we're just going to read chapter 8, which is about providence, and we'll decide what you think about Joseph then. Thanks, everybody. See you soon.